Okay, welcome everyone to this new ONHELIX innovation workshop talking about data protection in clinical trials. Just a little bit of context about this innovation workshop, which is obviously part of the ONHELIX conference, but also part of a series of workshops that we are developing with Pennington's Mencius Cooper on data protection. So one we held earlier this year, more around the GDPR and consideration for business development or marketing functions, and this one covering more the clinical specificities of data. And we are thinking about developing maybe more. So if you have any specific topics that you would like to bring to us and you would like us to cover, feel free to get in touch with me, Lisa, or Rachel Bradley, who is usually also the person covering them. So after this quick introduction, I will pass the floor to Lisa Page, who will give you a presentation about the topic. Obviously, this is a workshop, so you are very welcome to comment, ask questions, which we would encourage that. And if you can put them in the chat box, then either Lisa or myself will pick up on them and we will address. So Lisa.
Thank you very much, Aileen. Yes, my name's Lisa Page. So I'm an associate director at Pennington's Mencius Cooper in the life sciences team. Just probably 30 seconds about me. I basically came to the law late. I did a PhD in molecular microbiology and then worked for 15 years in the pharmaceutical industry, managing clinical trials for both at a pharmaceutical company and also with what is now IQVIA. So I sort of did all that side of things and then retrained to become a lawyer. So I now work in the life sciences team, helping clients to manage their clinical trials, look at the legal basis of what they're doing, and data protection is a big part of that. So I will share my screen now. If I can, this is where we hope that everything works well. Where are we? Hopefully I can find my presentation on my screens. Yes, perfect. There we go. So hopefully you can see. Can you see that screen? Hopefully.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. And as I said, I should say that I'm very happy for people to put questions in the chat box, and I'm also happy for people to, if they wish, if they have a burning question as I'm talking about something, I've got no problems with people just, unmuting and asking a question. I think the nice thing about this is that we're sort of a small enough group to be able to do that. So in terms of the, let's do the next slide. Hopefully I can do that. There we go. In terms of the agenda and what I'm covering today, obviously the overall topic is data protection in clinical trials. I'll start out with a brief update of the UK adequacy decision from the EU and a little bit of a short history on that. Then we'll talk about data flows, consent, transparency and privacy notices, the safeguards that can be put in place to protect personal data, touching on anonymization and pseudonymization, which are very sort of hot topics, as we can say at the moment. And there's some guidance that's coming out that has been published, but also some new guidance that will be coming out soon on those topics. We'll talk a little bit at the end about data subject rights and finish off with data privacy impact assessments. So, as I said, a sort of a bit of a whistle-stop tour, lots to cover, but we should have some time at the end to be able to take any questions that people have. So first topic, data protection post-Brexit and the adequacy decision. Just a little bit of background, as we all know, we left the EU on the 31st of January 2020. The transition period lasted till the end of last year. And at that point, the GDPR continued to apply. At the end of the transition period, GDPR became UK law, and we call it the UK GDPR, and it's the retained version of the GDPR as of that transition date. But we now have the independence under our own Data Protection Act with that retained GDPR to either keep the framework under review and potentially we may divert from it or diverge from it at some point. So what this means is now we've actually left the EU, we are no longer a member of the European Union. So what happens to data transfers of UK citizens' personal data to the EU. Those transfers of personal data can continue freely because the UK ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office has stated that it recognises the adequacy, which is this concept that the laws are adequate for protection of your own data subjects in the EU and the EEA. The only sort of practical point on this, which I'll try and bring out practical points as we go along, is that your privacy notices should have been updated to reflect the fact that any transfers now to the EU and the EEA are based on a UK adequacy finding rather than because we're a part of the EU. And then also what the ICO has said is that transfers outside of the EU and the EEA that are made to countries where the EU has provided as an adequacy decision, we in the UK are recognising that those countries are also adequate in terms of their data protection laws. So these are countries such as Canada and Japan. There's a list, I think there's about 8 or 9 countries on that list, and those transfers can continue freely. So in terms of data transfers out, EU, EEA and EU adequacy decision countries, it's all fine. The other way round, we're now a third country for the purposes of the GDPR. And basically from last year when we knew we were coming out, the UK had been saying to the EU, we want to have an adequacy decision for the UK so that transfers this way from the EU to the UK can still continue. As part of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is I'm sure most of you know, was basically entered into on the 30th of December of last year, there was an adequacy bridge, which was basically like, we're going to say you're okay until the 1st of July. And then during the first sort of half of this year, there were lots of sort of interim decisions, but no adequacy decision was made until the 28th of June, where the EU did issue an adequacy decision to the UK. So sort of a bit last minute and causing a little bit of concern, I think, amongst businesses. What about if we weren't adequate? It would have caused huge problems. But interestingly, and this is the only country where this has applied, the EU has said the adequacy decision will only last for 4 years and then we will reconsider. Because I think due to Brexit, they're very concerned about what the UK might do in terms of data protection laws. But at the moment, we're fine. So in summary, no significant change to date, which is a big relief for everybody. So the things that you are doing and the compliance is still the same as it was prior to basically under GDPR. So that's the sort of general context. If I move now on to the specifics here and data protection within clinical trials, I thought it was useful first to just, let you know, there's a lot of good guidance out there. The HRA has provided guidance, and it is, and the link is on there. And I think, as I said, if you can have the slides afterwards, I'm not sure. But anyway, you can see that there is a link on the HRA, and they provide actually some very useful templates for things like patient information, wording about privacy. What they won't do is provide sort of an example of your own privacy notice, so you still need to do your own for that. And the European Data Protection Board has provided an opinion, I think it was a couple of years ago now, on the interplay between the clinical trials regulation and GDPR, because the reason for this presentation is, and the reason that this is slightly complicated is because of the complex nature of clinical trials. So at the moment, if you want to look at guidance, the best guidance is the HRA guidance and also on the ICO's website, because that will deal with what you're doing in terms of collecting patient data in the UK. However, as we know, many clinical trials are multinational and multi-site. In terms of multi-site, clinical trials in the UK ethics committees supported by the HRA, they'll consider a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, and I'll talk a little bit about that a bit later in the talk. But basically in the UK, you don't have to submit each time, evidence of your approach to data protection. But there are regulators and research ethics committee in different jurisdictions that might take a slightly different approach. So although you can have a sort of approval of your data protection approach in the UK, and then other trials will sort of fall under that. That's not the case in some other European countries. So one of the most important things in any data protection analysis is to actually stop at the beginning of what you're doing and try to work out how that personal data is flowing between you and various other organisations in relation to a clinical trial. So this is quite a simplistic diagram, because we also know that there are other things like, laboratories, courier firms, all sorts of things that come into a clinical trial. But this is the sort of probably the most straightforward, which talks about, you've got the trial subjects, the investigator site and the sponsor with a CRO if they're involved. And the investigator is collecting the data from the trial subjects. The investigator records the data in CRFs, and the investigator assigns the unique code to each trial subject. So it's the investigator and the trial site that hold the key that links that code that goes on the CRF to a trial subject. And that's very important when we come to talk about things like pseudonymization. The sponsor only receives coded CRFs, but the sponsor also, and very importantly, has the right and the obligation to verify the non-coded data by obviously attendance at site and monitoring, which can be by sponsor or the CRO. So as I said, in terms of the access to the data, those parties all potentially have access to not only the coded data, but also the raw data and the actual patient's personal data. So important to know your flows, and I'll talk about the reason for that in a moment. It's also important when you're looking at that to work out whether you are, as an organisation or as a sponsor, or if you're a CRO, where is the delegation? Are you basically having total delegation to a CRO? So that's on the right-hand side, where basically the sponsor delegates pretty much everything other than those responsibilities under the clinical trials directive that they have to retain to a CRO, and the CRO has those direct relationships with the investigator and the trial site. Or alternatively, the sponsor contracts directly with the trial site, and the investigator and the CRO provides various services along with that. And that's important when you're looking at your data flows, because it helps you to determine who are the controllers and who are the processors. So in terms of controllers and processors, because the sponsor determines what data is collected for the clinical trial, the sponsor, for the most part, will always act as the controller in relation to that data that is collected for research purposes. So if the data is collected for research purposes, the sponsor is the controller of that. The CRO is the processor of the sponsor, because it processes that data at the sponsor's request. And the trial site and the investigator is also a processor of that data for the data collected specifically related to the trial. So those, in most cases, that there is always that, there will always be that controller processor roles. So when we talked about delegation to a CRO, it might be in some cases that the CRO is also a controller of certain data. So that's something that you want to consider and need to consider very carefully, depending on what delegation has been done. But the CRO could easily, in some certain cases, acting as a controller, and then the trial site would be a processor of the CRO for data collected. So that's an important sort of differentiation, and something that you need to consider. In addition, and one of the things that I think adds this level of complexity to clinical trials is that there are, for all of the patient data, there are controllers in common, because, and the UK HRA has said, trial subjects are patients. So the trial site and the investigator is acting as a controller of that data that's collected in relation to patient care. So a patient comes in for a site visit and they have their blood pressure checked, or they have a lab result. That data is not only going to the sponsor for the clinical trial, but it is also forming part of the patient's medical records. So for that data related to patient care, the trial site and the investigator is the controller of that data. So we call it controllers in common because it's the same data. So it is your blood pressure results, your weight, lab data, and two separate organizations control that data, and it is common to the same organizations. So in the UK, that's what the regulator says. Interestingly, there's some different approaches with other regulators. In France, they basically say that investigators are still actually processors of sponsors. They don't consider their controllers in common. But in Germany, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands, the investigator is a controller. So there are slightly different approaches in Europe, which unfortunately means that you do need to, if you're doing multi-center trials, you will need to be considering how and what you need to do in terms of, and I'll talk about this later, some of the transparency and the privacy notices that you'll need to put in place for your trial subjects. And just to sort of finish off this sort of data flow section, international data transfers. Now, generally, when personal data is transferred to a non-EEA country, and also in the case of a country that doesn't have an adequacy decision, the data exporter has to ensure that the data transferred has an adequate level of protection. In sort of more commercial situations, you'd probably have standard contractual clauses, and there are new versions that the EU has published of the standard contractual clauses because the previous ones weren't actually compliant with the GDPR. So those are the ones that you would need to use if, for example, you're transferring data that's considered to be personal data to, say, an organization based in the USA. And there are also binding corporate rules that can be put into place between organizations. Not used so much, I would suggest, potentially in clinical trial contracts, but I have seen standard contractual clauses being used. So that again is an important aspect that needs to be considered if you're doing data transfers. However, there are some things that you can do and some safeguards that might mean that some of those international data transfers are not actually transfers of personal data. And I'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. So the next sort of aspect that I wanted to consider in relation to trials is consent and the legal basis for processing of data in clinical trials. And I think that terminology, when the GDPR came out, caused a lot of people a slight concern because, of course, within clinical trials, everybody knows that you need to take informed consent of patients. It's freely taken. There's a very detailed patient information leaflet that is provided to the patient, and they must give consent in writing to their participation in a trial. And so that is something that is a fundamental aspect of clinical trials, but it's different to what you would call consent under the GDPR. And I think there was a little bit of a confusion at that point. So consent under the GDPR allows processing of a person's personal data. So if you give consent, you say, I agree to you using my data in this way. That's a legal basis under Article 6 of the GDPR. And it's also a ground for the lawful basis of processing of special category data, which includes medical data under Article 9 of the GDPR. But there are issues with consent. And in fact, HRA guidance specifically states that sponsors should not rely on consent as the legal basis for the processing of personal data for research. And the reasons for this are really twofold. The imbalance of power. So if you are a patient and your doctor is asking you for consent, that can be potentially considered to be that there is an imbalance of power between you and the doctor, which might mean the consent is not freely given. And also your consent for the processing of your personal data may be withdrawn. So consent is not the way to obtain, to process personal data under a clinical trial. Now, it's important just to say here, withdrawal of consent for processing of personal data is not the same as withdrawal of informed consent. So, but as you'll see when we talk about it later, it actually, at the end of the day, kind of the process comes to the same conclusion, but you don't use consent. So obviously withdrawal of consent for informed consent basically means that at any time a patient can say, I don't want to be in this trial anymore, I withdraw my consent. But their data that has been collected up to and including the time that they withdrew their consent is still allowed to be used. And that's always something that's very clearly stated in a patient information leaflet. So that's, and at that point, basically any legal basis for processing personal data would fall away post a patient withdrawing their informed consent for participation. So as I said, it's because there's so many of these consent words, it does get a little bit confusing. But anyway, so you have your informed consent, your patient is in the trial. What is your legal basis? So for universities, NHS organisations, research council, any public authority, your legal basis is a task in the public interest. So that is what you use as your legal basis for processing personal data that comes in for a clinical trial. You need to document that justification within your privacy notices as to why you are a public organisation and therefore you can process in on this basis. If you are a commercial company, it is your legitimate interest to be able to process this data, and that's again what should be in your privacy notice. And it says that you document the decision and that you consider that this is your legitimate interest to process this data. So those are your legal basis. Now, for processing of special category data, which of course is the majority of data within a clinical trial, you have to have an additional ground to be able to do that processing. And those additional grounds are that the processing is necessary for reasons of public interest in the area of public health. And also, then that's for obviously public authorities, and for commercial organizations, it is public interest for scientific research. So those are your additional grounds. And again, that should be set out in your privacy notice. And it's also very important in terms of meeting the criteria for the additional grounds that the data is subject to appropriate safeguards. And we'll talk about safeguards just after we talk a little bit more about transparency requirements and how you can meet those requirements for the additional safeguards to be in place for processing of special category data. Right, so if we move on now to the transparency, which is basically your privacy notices. So most people that I have advised will now provide privacy notices alongside with their patient information leaflet and their informed consent form, with not a statement of I consent to my data, but with a statement on the informed consent form that says I confirm that I have received the privacy notice that's attached to this informed consent form, which really then ties the two together. And it says that as a patient, I have consented to my participation in the trial. And on the basis of that consent to participation, this is the privacy notice of what will happen to my data. So in terms of privacy notice, it's required information about the processing of the personal data, what's going to be processed, how it's processed. As I said here, provided alongside the patient informed consent form. But there are also other mechanisms to provide transparency information. So, and often, most organizations will also have privacy notices on their websites. And I've seen different approaches to this. Sometimes organizations have a website privacy notice and then a patient privacy notice. So that can work, or privacy policy, I should say, and that can work very well. And I think the general best practice in terms of data protection overall is to have a sort of tiered approach. So perhaps you might have, in relation to your patient informed consent, you might have a privacy notice, so quite a high level, this is what we're going to do with your data. The terms on which we do that are set out in our privacy policy, which is on our website. So it's very important to look at how your privacy information and your transparency is being provided to patients. And there's also this requirement also to be able to justify your decisions about transparency, how you're going to approach it. So on transparency, in many cases, organisations may wish to undertake further processing of data. So, for example, data that's been collected initially for clinical purposes, an organisation wants to now process that data for research. So there are, and I'll talk about a few exemptions in the next slide, but it is important, and a really good way of dealing with this is basically utilising your privacy notices when you collect the data in the first place for clinical purposes to just make participants, clinical trial participants or patients aware that and the example I've set here is very straightforward wording. Personal data that can identify you will be used by research teams in this organisation and shared with external research organisations, commercial companies, universities in this country and abroad for scientific research purposes. And that just means that you're adding that as information that's provided to a participant so that they can see that potentially their data may be used. As it says here, scientific research purposes should be detailed, but they don't need to be. Scientific research purposes in protocol number XYZ. It's more scientific research purposes, and you just perhaps want to be a little bit clearer about potentially the type of research, the therapeutic area or areas, and that can really help in terms of making sure that you're meeting the transparency requirements. As I said, there are exemptions for research, and those are if personal data is obtained indirectly for research, although it's a good idea to give those information within your privacy notices, it's not actually a requirement if, and there's a couple of things, if you have technical and organisation measures in place to protect that data. For example, it could be pseudonymized data, or the research activity is utilised without using any identifiable data, so it's anonymized data. Or, for example, if to try to give information to data subjects at that stage would be impossible or involve a disproportionate effort. So, for example, if you're, say, reviewing an incredibly large database to pull out patients that have a particular condition, you may not be able to notify all those patients that you're going to utilize their data, for example, to do, research something in relation to that wasn't the purpose for when they first had that data collected. I mean, it's very good practice to establish a process within, for example, your QMS, your quality management system, to document how those decisions might be made, and at what point would you say, actually, what sort of data are we using? Actually, we can't contact data subjects because it would involve disproportionate effort. So, it's important within all of this to make sure that you're thinking about how the data is collected, what information you provided at the time, and therefore what you can do with it and still be compliant. Sorry. So I've talked quite a lot about safeguards and what safeguards can be put in place and how important they are. So in this section, I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about what the various safeguards can be that will assist with data protection compliance. So one of the sort of catch-all phrases is appropriate organisation and technical measures in place. And what that means is that you have things to ensure that your data is processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent manner. So the privacy notices deal with that. Lawful means you have a lawful basis. Data processing is kept to a minimum, which means that you only process that part of the data that you need to, and data is secure. So basically that's your IT security systems. There are some exemptions to data subject rights, which we'll talk about a bit later when personal data is processed for health research, but those exemptions apply. They only apply if you have all these other safeguards in place. So drilling down to a little bit more detail, what constitutes appropriate safeguards? Well, thankfully and very helpfully, a safeguard is that a clinical trial has approval from a research ethics committee. And that is considered to be a safeguard that says if the research ethics committee believes that you are that your trial is going to be processing data lawfully, that is an additional safeguard. And basically, as I said, you've got those other technical and organisational safeguards in place, which include things like pseudonymisation and anonymisation, and we'll talk about that later. There is this data minimisation, and those exemptions that I talked about are only exercised unless it's impossible to process the data without, unless it's impossible to process the data with those safeguards in place and those exemptions to data subject rights. A little bit more detail on that. So technical and organisational measures. This is security and storage of data to make sure that you have good policies in place. You look at pseudonymisation or anonymisation, which we'll talk about next, and data minimisation. And there are some really good sort of materials out there. So NHS Digital Data Security and Protection Toolkit is useful, and also useful not only for NHS organisations, but for other organisations to see what the NHS does, and you can pick up some good information from them. And as I said, I think before, the most important thing is to make sure that your QMS, your quality management system, has a section on data processing and data management, and it's clear how you're going to make these decisions and what processes you're going to put in place. So for clinical trials, there is, as we talked about before, pseudonymisation is something that is utilised quite a lot. And there is a difference between anonymisation and pseudonymisation. So the difference is sort of set out here, and I thought this was quite a nice sort of visual representation of the differences. So personal information, name of Jane Doe, that goes through a key, and then it's turned into this mixture of letters and numbers, which is pseudonymized data. The importance about this sort of slide and this sort of representation is the fact that those arrows move in both directions. So you can go from that key back to Jane Doe. So you can go from that pseudonymized data identifier and go back to Jane Doe. For anonymization, basically, you are taking Jane Doe, you are converting that information relating to Jane Doe into completely anonymized data. And once it is done, it is irreversible. There is no, or there should be, if it's truly anonymized, there should be no ability to go back to Jane Doe. Now, obviously, as we all know in clinical trials, one of the most important, it's incredibly important at any point for somebody to be able to identify what, from a pseudonymized data, who that patient is for patient safety purposes. For example, if a lab result comes back and there needs to be, some sort of urgent information sent to the patient, or for example, for serious adverse events and pharmacovigilance, incredibly important. So the big question that is very important in this whole area is pseudonymized data personal data? So I think it is generally accepted now that pseudonymized data remains within the scope of the law. So it basically means that it is personal data, but it very much depends on the context. So in the example here, there are two different scenarios. So if you have the key and the pseudonymized data, it is personal data in your hands. So for example, for an investigator, they have the key. So they know that, in this patient, AB123 is Jane Doe. That data is personal data in their hands. Sponsors and CROs, for the most part, although they don't have the key when the CRFs come through, people in their organization have access to the actual patient records, which link the pseudonymized data and the patient, that data is still personal data in their hands. However, if an organization only receives pseudonymized data and they have no access to the key, so for example, a laboratory who receive samples, they receive ABC123, they may know that they've picked it up from a site in Manchester or in London. They have no idea who that patient is, and they have no access to that key. So in that context, the current thinking is, and the general principle is, that if you only receive the pseudonymized data, it isn't personal data in your hands. So, and that's important when you start talking about looking at data flows and the sort of contractual provisions you need to have in place with some of the suppliers and the CROs that are related to data in your trials. So, okay, pseudonymized data is personal data, but it does have some benefits, even if it's personal data. It has benefits of security because basically, you know, the data, although it is still personal data, it's not people's names and addresses. It has a benefit because it's purpose limitations. So you are only processing the personal, the really personal part of it, where you need to, for the most part, you're processing this key that will have, you know, information, medical information, but not be linked to a person for the most part. Quite importantly, if there's a data breach of pseudonymized data, there's a reduced risk of harm, because unless the person who has the data breach that you will have also has the key, then they don't know who they can't link that information back to a living individual, so it's not personal data in their hands as well. So it helps for data breaches. And by utilizing pseudonymization, you're basically conducting what all the current regulators talk about. It's incredibly important, is this data protection by design. So considering things like your data flows, how you're going to inform patients, and the pseudonymization that is a protective measure. So in terms of current information on pseudonymization and also health data, there have been a few things that have happened and a few bits of guidance that I set out sort of at the beginning of the talk. But at the moment, the ICO has issued some draft guidelines on anonymization and pseudonymization, but in some kind of weird teaser, they've issued chapter 1, but nothing else. So we have some ideas and some additional information that fits with what I've said to you before about what the ICO thinks about pseudonymization and its protective nature, and also that it depends on whose hands the pseudonymized data is in. But the full document will be published later in 2021. And in addition, the European Data Protection Board, which I think will also be very, although it's not, these decisions are now longer binding on us, I think they will, the ICO will certainly look to them. They're going to be providing some new guidance on health data in 2021, because obviously within clinical trials, and I haven't even touched on this, you talk about things like, you know, the pharmacovigilance data and how is that dealt with in the data protection context. So pseudonymization, health data, there's going to be some hopefully very useful and instructive updates that will come out later on in this year. So I'm just going to finish off talking a little bit about data subject rights. As we've said earlier, in terms of data subject rights, if you are processing personal data for research purposes and you have those appropriate safeguards in place, things such as pseudonymization and your technical measures, your data security, there are certain data subject rights that people all usually have, which is the right to say, remove my data, erase my data, the right to, you know, make my data accurate, to stop processing it, and the right for me to have access to it, that are limited when it comes to data used for research purposes, for example, in trials. So, and this is where the sort of the informed consent withdrawal and the data, but allowing data collected up to that point to be processed, fits in with the rights of a data subject to, for example, ask for their data to be erased. Those are limited in the same way as the limit when the patient informed consent is withdrawn, but processing can still take place. So they are consistent in that way. And for example, right to access by the data subject. Ordinarily, I can say, okay, utility company, give me all my personal data that you have on me. Whereas for a clinical trial, you can quite validly say, no, we can't give you your information because it's been pseudonymized, or it might cause serious harm. So as I said, those rights are definitely limited, and that is usually also something that's important to set out within your privacy notices. And just as a sweep up, the right to data portability is not applicable, if I can say it, to research under legitimate interest or public interest. So you can't, a data subject can't say, okay, I was in this trial, can you transfer my data to, organization X because I want to go into that trial? As you all know, that doesn't make any sense, but it's just important to make that clear. So in terms of just the last thing that I wanted to cover, and that is data privacy impact assessments. They are incredibly important to do, but as I said, in relation to clinical trials, DPIAs tend to be done at the level of the quality management system. So DPIAs, you don't need to go, okay, I'm doing this trial, I'm going to collect data from these patients, it's going to be utilizing this CRO. As a company undertaking trials, or for example, if you're a CRO and you undertake trials on sponsors' behalf, you will have a QMS system, a quality management system that sets out how you approach this. And that is the level that you need to do in terms of, that is essentially your data privacy impact assessment. So you don't need to undertake DPIAs on a per trial basis, which is incredibly helpful. Obviously, it goes without saying that most people do this anyway, you have your quality management system subject to regular review. Now, this doesn't mean that there is never a case where for a particular trial, you would never do a DPIA, because, for example, there may be some aspects that are outside of the norm. I don't know, perhaps you're using AI to review some certain sort of data. That in and of itself, because it's a automated processing, may require a specific DPIA for that aspect. So it's not sort of carte blanche, but for the most part, you won't have to do DPIAs for each individual trial. So as I said, that has been a whistle-stop tour. If anybody has any questions, I'll stop sharing my screen in a moment. It's just so that I can see the chat, because while I'm sharing my screen, I really can't see the chat. But as I said, so if anybody's got any questions or any comments or any best practice that they've done, I'd be more than happy to take questions or have a discussion now. So let me just stop share. There we go. Great. So
thank you, Lisa.
Yeah,
that was a really, really good coverage. So it's taking questions from there. I can't see direct questions for now, so maybe I'll kick off and I see if that prompts some. As absolutely not data experts myself, I was just wondering if there were any different type of data or categories of data, and especially when we're seeing more omics data coming into the play, or used as tools for clinical development. So I don't know if that's relevant to have categorization, or they're all the same, and that's absolutely fine.
So the genomics data,
for example.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is, it's a very, very good question. And I think that's some of the, so genomics data, you would say that, you know, my DNA is me, no matter what you do to it. So I think that is classed as personal data. I would actually suggest to people, if you want to see a really, really good example of how an organization has set up its entire sort of privacy policies, I would actually have a look at the 100,000 Genomes Project, which is oh gosh, what's it called? Genomics UK. Now,
England, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't do those policies, so I'm not saying this is some, but I think they take a really, really good approach to that, and they basically provide information not only and privacy notices not only for the patients that are going into this, or the participants, I should say, that have gone into this project, but also their family members. So as I said, that, but you're right, Aileen, it is, and that's something that people do grapple with, dealing with genomics data. And I didn't really deal with it in this talk, but it is a whole sort of additional level of complexity that you have to deal with if you're basically collecting that sort of data.
Yeah, so they are personal data, but with an additional layer of complexity.
Yes.
And are these guidelines on Genomics England available for all?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So, and it's not so much the guidelines, it's just if you go
the
on
data,
their website and just look at their privacy notices, because they have privacy notices for all sorts of things. And I just, as I said, I think it's, I do know the head of legal there. I've met him a couple of times. And when I first met him, I said, hey, do you know what? You did a really good job here. That was a really very sort of considered and clear approach to managing what is quite a complex project. And as I think most people know, that project, they've reached their target, and I think they are continuing to sort of look at that really, really important genomics information.
Well, that's reassuring.
Yes.
So is there any more question coming from the audience?
I always think, as I think I said to Aileen earlier, even if I know lots about a topic, I'm always terrified to ask questions. So as I said, I don't have any problems. But as I said, if anybody does have any questions that have come from this, you can contact me through LinkedIn. You can contact me through the Pennington's website. And, you know, we do these sorts of advice all the time, and we're very, very happy to sort of help to guide people through. And, you know, even we work with a lot of spin outs. So when they're first getting into their first clinical trial, they're suddenly like, oh my gosh, you know, and for example, they need to do things like appoint a data protection officer, and who should that be, and how will that work? So as I said, it is a slightly difficult process, but once you get your process in place and keep it updated, it's not that difficult. It's just a bit of a hill to climb if you're starting from the beginning.
It's sustainable. Once you build it, then you're good to go.
Yes.
It's probably good to put the safeguard. And same on the CRO side. I mean, of course, the larger one, they would know what to do. But if you're smaller, if you're starting, and as you said, I think in your diagram, that was showing very well the different implications of sponsors, CROs, and site investigators. The CRO could be multiple because you could have some, you know, different one dealing with different aspects of the research, and some of them may be very small and also starting. And so it's to know where to start with.
Some of them will be dealing with personal data. Some of them will only be dealing with pseudonymized data without a key. So some you need data protection processing clauses, some you don't. So as I said, it is it's complex. But as I said, you know, you are dealing with, when it is personal data, it's very, very sensitive personal data. So it's necessarily needs some careful thought.
Yes.
The overarching advice: have a good think about it. Ask somebody if you need to, have any questions.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. And as we said, this was recorded. That will be available on the One Nucleus app for replay. And then we'll make it available to just wider audience. If you have any colleagues or people you know would be interested in watching, I think it's a really, really good coverage of this whole data protection clinical trials. And if Lisa is happy, we can share her details if you want to get in touch, of course. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.